Prime Minister Shinzo Abe credits you with being the driving force behind so-called Womenomics. What is Womenomics? How has Shinzo Abe addressed it, and what more needs to be done, Kathy?
Sure. So what is Womenomics? It's a combination of women and economics, those two terms. And it was a term that we crafted back 20 years ago in 1999 when I was, as an analyst, trying to figure out what the heck is Japan going to do about its demographic crisis. And so looking around me, I saw that a lot of very talented, highly educated women, some of them were working, but many of them were not working outside the home, particularly after they started having children. So we did some numbers and we looked at if you could close the gender gap in employment between Japanese men, which is one of the highest in the OECD, with Japanese women rising to the same level, albeit we know that's going to take a long period of time, but that could amount to a very significant boost to GDP. Our most recent estimate of this was back in 2014, which produced a lift potentially of GDP of as much as almost 13%. And I think in terms of policies, it ranges from what I call the infrastructure side of things, which is to provide more capacity for daycare, especially for young children. Yeah. They also force Japanese companies to disclose data on gender diversity, which is something that Japan's never really done before. So not everything is wonderful yet, of course. It's still a work in progress, but I think there's been quite a lot of work done to date.
Right, and Kathy, I was reading this New York Times article the other day, which was quite fascinating. They had this analysis on government data from Keio University. Women who work more than 49 hours a week typically do close to 25 hours of household work a week. I mean, is this still a matter of legal barriers, do you think? Or do you think that we are really actually seeing a shift in cultural gender stereotypes?
Yeah, so I think, articles like that are portraying reality at the end of the day. But I think it's important to also mention that a lot of this has to do with, frankly, the way that Japanese companies operate, especially at the personnel level. Face it, for a typical Japanese company, not all, but the average ones, really evaluate their personnel on the basis of time as opposed to performance or output. And if it's a basis of time is your main metric, then of course, if the person who is earning the income for the household is trying to perform well, they're going to spend maximum time out of the house with the company and minimum time at home. So I think we really have to get to the root of this system. It's not a legal obstacle by any means. Companies have the ability to change that system. It's just how it's been running for many decades. So I think that is one starting point. And I think you're also very encouragingly seeing millennials, young people who I'm encountering a lot of young men these days who say, I don't want to work like my father and grandfather 24/7, married to my company or my job. I want to spend more time with my family. I would actually like my spouse to work outside the home. So I'm hopeful, I know it's going to take a lot more time, but I'm hopeful that this younger generation is actually going to move that needle a lot faster than we've seen to date.
Kathy, are you seeing any of the benefits, are you seeing any of the fruits of Womenomics yet, in your view? I mean, with the GDP numbers you referred to earlier, and we talked about better than expected, but we had that contraction the previous quarter. Is there anything that you can take heart of?
Yeah, for example, if you look at not per capita wage data, which is still pretty flattish, but if you look at total aggregate employee income, it's running at a record pace of close to 4% in terms of year-on-year growth. And this is for Japan, which is unheard of. And I think the reason why those numbers are so high is largely because we have record female labor participation in Japan. There are more women working here in Japan, about 70% of the female workforce, than in the United States of America, for instance. Of course, another driver is older people post-retirement are going back into work. So I think we're seeing some of this greater womenomics at work, female participation rising, feeding into higher incomes. And of course, that's helping to underpin some of the consumption trends that we've been seeing, of late. So again, it's still early days. A lot of work still needs to be done. We all know that here. But I think it's also unfair to say that nothing has changed and nothing is happening either.
Yeah, and Kathy, I just want to put your investing cap on and maybe talk a little bit more about the Japanese equity market, because we have a chart that kind of shows where flows have been going. And it seems like there's a lot more interest, at least from international investors, towards China, EM. What is the bullish case now for Japanese equities? What's the outlook from you?
Well, I can tell you, having traveled around much of the world year to date, there's not a lot of interest or focus on the Japanese market, despite the fact that earnings have more than doubled, despite the fact that valuations are back to recessionary level lows, about 12 times PE. Foreigners, as you know, have essentially exited Japan basically since the middle part of 2015. So exposure is very light. And I think that reflects people's general skepticism that it can continue, number one. And number two, I think there's an underappreciation of what I think is most exciting happening in the market today. It has to do with corporate governance reforms and the implications thereof. We are seeing never before seen announcements by banks and companies of unraveling cross-shareholdings. We are seeing activists going into companies and being able to put their representatives on the boards of Japanese companies that have been in troubled situations. Again, still early days, a lot of work ahead of us, but I think some of these things that a lot of foreign investors were deeply skeptical, said Japan would never, ever change. We're starting to see cracks in the system that are actually generating some very interesting single stock opportunities within the market. So I personally believe, as an active investor, we're seeing a lot of PE funds also flow into Japan. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunities, given that half the market is still trading below book value and that, like I said, positioning is extremely light.